Tonight we are going to proceed with our next session, a lecture on battling Islam sectarianism in the Nusantara. Before that, allow me to introduce the speaker. He is Dr. Zainal Abidin Bagir. He received his doctorate in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana University. His previous education includes undergraduate in mathematics at Bandung Institute of Technology, Indonesia in 1992, and master's program in Islamic Philosophy and Science at International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, in 1994. He conducts research and writes on subjects related to religion and contemporary issues, with special attention to religion and science and to the Muslim world, and issues on the relation between religious communities. Without further ado, I allow Dr. Zainal Abidin to proceed with his lecture.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this very interesting conference. So the topic given to me is battling Islamic sectarianism in Nusantara. I was thinking actually to change it into not battling sectarianism, but living with sectarianism. Why? I'll give you the reason, but then I'll try to, after listening to Bob Hefner's two presentations last night and today, which fits really well into my presentation, I will start by reviewing the idea he presented today and last night, and then put my own subject within this, within the framework. So I and Bob Hefner have worked together for a number of years, and we are now in the middle of completing a research with the title of Scaling Up Pluralism. So we share the framework, and that's how I'm going to use it in my presentation. So the title now is not sectarianism, but sectarianization as an anti-pluralist scaling up. I'll explain that shortly, but before that, a quick review. This is what Bob have been talking since last night. That basically civic pluralism consists of two main issues. Well, two or three. But the most important thing, I just summarize it in two things, normativity and scaling up. So normative work for pluralism includes formulation of an inclusive public ethics, for example, stemming from Sharia, which is resonant with democracy. So we discussed this a lot. Professor Farid Alatas spoke about progressive Islam, which is also a type of pluralist normativity. But then normative work, Bob mentioned several times, is not enough. There's also another process which is called scaling up. This includes dissemination and institutionalizations of the norms, making it having a greater presence and influence in state and society. This is also the process where the original idea, the original normativity, is taken to social fields beyond its place of origin. So basically it's a dissemination process. It's also institutionalization process. Disseminations can go on horizontally, trying to persuade other citizens, for example, but also institutionalization, trying to make it to influence public policy, for example, linking it to actors, institutions, movements to become a living practice. So but this is a pluralist where we've been talking about discussing about pluralist scaling up of pluralism, but actually the same process is going on also for anti-pluralist ideas. So when we discuss civil Islam, progressive Islam, we talk about the ideas we like about the good guys, and now it's time to discuss about the bad guys. But it's not, of course, not as strict as that. As I'll show later, much of it is an issue of competitions between different normativities. Good norms may not win the day, and norms, exclusive norms, for example, or anti-pluralist norms, it may win. So I understand, I'm trying to understand sectarianization, not sectarianism, in this frame. I'm referring to a recent book, which is very interesting. It's written by Nadir Hashemi and Danny Postel, just published a few months ago, actually. The title is Sectarianization, trying to explain the new politics of the Middle East, which is after Arab Spring. So instead of talking about sectarianism, what I think is more important is to understand the process of sectarianization. Because sectarian differences have been with us all along, I mean, throughout the history of Islam. And that is actually normal. But what is not normal or what is dangerous is sectarianization. I understand sectarianization as an anti-pluralist norm, sectarian anti-pluralist norm, scaled up through sectarianization. The main question in the book is how to explain sectarian conflicts in the Middle East. Of course, the situation in the Middle East is completely different from the situations in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries. As Bob Hefner mentioned yesterday in regard to democracy, Arab countries actually is an exception to the democratic norms which is present in much of the Islamic world. So in terms of the conflicts, this is also probably quite different from the kind of conflict, whether violent or not, which we see in Indonesia, Malaysia, or other Southeast Asian countries. But I think the attempt to explain the conflict in terms of sectarianizations, we can use that. We can try to understand what is happening here. I'm using the same term. So for the editors, sectarianization is different from sectarianism. It's a social theory of sectarianism. It's explaining how sectarianism has been used to create conflict. So before we go further, I think it's important to review where should we put this term, sectarianization. So in general, when social scientists try to explain conflicts, there are three main schools of thought. First, what is called as primordialist, which basically it only points to the existence of different identities, which may be a source of conflict. But it doesn't explain further than that, because there are also many examples in which people live in diversity. People with different identities, they can live together. So saying in the case of the Middle East, for example, like Syria, as a sectarian conflicts, that doesn't explain much. And probably it's as much a propaganda and less an explanation of what actually is taking place in Syria. That there are sectarian differences in Syria, it's been the case for a long time. But the civil war is new. So the mere existence of sectarian identities doesn't explain the conflict which we have now. So primordialist explanation, which basically says, well, and this is very popular among many policy makers in many countries. I mean, referring to the conflict as an age-old conflict. The conflict in Arab countries. This is not age-old. This is actually a very recent conflict. The conflict which we have been seeing in a number of Arab countries, especially in Syria. The second one is instrumentalist, which basically says that they don't regard the identities as something important, as having causal factor. But the identities are objects which can be manipulated and used as a means of mobilization. So this is an instrument, the sectarian identities as instrument to mobilize conflict. But it doesn't explain also a few some very important things about the deeply rooted identities, which also sometimes is very effective in being used as an instrument. The third explanation, and this is where the term sectarianization comes from, is the constructivist. Basically, it says that ethnicity or religious identity is not fixed, unlike the primordialists, which says that this is something inherited from few centuries in the past. But it is a political construct which does not necessarily lead to conflict, because there are many cases in which the presence of sectarian identities don't lead to conflict. So I quote from the book, conflict flows from pathological social systems and political opportunity structures that breed conflict from multiple social cleavages that lie beyond the control of the individual. So sectarianization is a constructivist explanation. So this is where the term sectarianization comes from. More quotes from the book which explain what is actually sectarianization. I'll just read some of this. Sectarianization is a process shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve popular mobilization around particular religious identity markers. So actually, it's not only sectarian identities. We can use the term also for other identity-based conflicts. Class dynamics, fragile states, and geopolitical rivalries also shape the sectarianization process. Authoritarianism, not theology, is the critical factor that shapes the sectarianization process. So it's important to shift the attention not to the content of the beliefs itself, not to the theology as a causal factor for conflict, but to political system or political mobilization. In this case, like authoritarianism, for example, in many countries, has used identity as a source to divide people, to win political gains and others. It's a perpetuation of political rule via identity mobilization. So the key terms here is mobilization and manipulation. So when we discuss, that's why I'm a bit reluctant to use the term battling Islamic sectarianism, because I don't think sectarianism, we should battle against sectarianism. It's been there and it will be there for a long time. But what makes it dangerous, again, is how it is manipulated, it is used as mobilization issue. And I'll give you examples in which sectarian identities may lead to conflict and may not. So I'll give some examples from Indonesia as well as other countries. One example is regarding Shiism. This is the main issue in the book Sectarianization, which I mentioned earlier. The main issue in the book is Shia-Sunni conflicts, how it is portrayed in explanation about the conflicts in Syria and others. But Shia has existed for a long time and did not always engender violent conflicts. There are many instances in which Shia and Sunni may live together, even today. And also you can see the example, the Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, the two main issues when we talk about sectarian conflicts in the Middle East today is Saudi Arabia and Iran as the two main powers. But you can see that before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, actually Saudi Arabia was in very good terms with Iran. At that time, Iran, of course, it was a majority Shia country, but it was okay. I mean, there was no mobilization, no campaign against, no sectarian campaign. It became an issue after 1979. So this shows that the mere presence of sectarian identities don't necessarily lead to conflict. So different times may show different relation between different sectarian identities. Syria, actually, the civil war which we see today and in Indonesia, and I guess probably also in Malaysia, is always portrayed as Shia versus Sunni. And it was used as a campaign against Shia in Sunni majority countries. It actually started as a cross-sectarian protest against the regime. And the regime was not a Shia regime. Now it's usually portrayed as a Shia regime. It's closer actually to Alawi. Not strictly Shia. So it started with a cross-sectarian protest, but then the sectarian identities were used to put one group of people face to face with other groups of people. In Indonesia also, Shia has been part of the history of Islam in Indonesia. Many of Shia rituals actually have been part of cultural festivals in many places in Indonesia until today. So, and I don't say that they have in the past always lived harmoniously. There were debates, there were fatwa actually against Shia, but we have never seen the magnitude of conflict, sometimes even violent conflicts, which we see today. And in Indonesia, it started only, I can say for sure, it started in 2012. Again, I didn't say that there was no debate, etc. It's been there for a long time, but only starting in 2012, only 5 years ago, it became an open conflict. So why did it happen? There are many explanations. Part of it is sectarianization. That is, it's a political conflict, but then using sectarian identities as a source of mobilization. And even now, actually, in most parts of Indonesia, there is no problem with Shia. I can give many examples, like for example, in Central Java in Jepara, there was even a Shia mosque, Shia pesantren, and they are okay. There has never been conflict there. The conflict in East Java, in Sampang, was actually an exception. It's not a rule. So why is it that in different places there are similar sectarian, the presence of different sects of Sunni and Shia, and no conflict, while in East Java there is conflict? Actually, it's also very interesting. Even in East Java, you can compare between Sampang, in which there was conflict in 2011 and 2012, and Pasuruan. In Pasuruan, there's also sometimes tensions, but no conflicts until today. So why is it even within one province in East Java? So you can say in terms of culture, they are very similar. There is a provincial level of MUI fatwa against Shia in East Java, and this is the only province in which there is a fatwa against Shia. So even within that one province with many similarities, in one place there's conflict, in another place there's no conflict. Well, the one in Sampang is Java, that's in the island of Madura. But even within the island of Madura, from one kabupaten or one district to another, it's already a totally different Sunni-Shia relation. Next kabupaten in Madura, there's no conflict between Shia and Sunni. Why is there conflict in Sampang? So there has to be other explanation. There has to be explanation other than in terms of sectarian identities. So what happens in Sampang is sectarianization. I can give almost exactly the same example with the Ahmadiyya. Ahmadiyya have been in Indonesia for well, almost 100 years actually. Again, there were tensions and others, but we have not seen the magnitude of conflict as we see today. In the morning, Professor Syed Farid Alatas mentioned the difference between Ahmadiyya and Shia. There was almost an agreement in the Muslim world that Ahmadiyya is outside Islam. But that also actually, I think, does not explain why both Shia and Ahmadiyya, at this point, they become the object of animosity in some mainstream Muslim groups. So Ahmadiyya's theology, I agree that, for example, you can see in, what is it, the Risalah Amman, for example. That's the document created in Jordan a few years ago, which basically says that it acknowledges many madhahib in Islam. It also mentions Ja'fari, Shia, Ibadi, etc. And they said they are all within Islam, and Muslims should not do takfir toward these groups. So there is an agreement that Shia is part of Islam. But there is almost a universal agreement also in the Muslim world that Ahmadiyya is outside of Islam. But I think that also doesn't explain why both these groups sometimes they become the object of violence. Again, the common explanation which is plausible is this issue of sectarianization. And again, it's very interesting, and I suspect the situation in Malaysia is quite similar. In Indonesia, in most places, actually, Ahmadiyya is okay. There is no conflict. The conflict is isolated in certain parts of Indonesia, so not in all parts. If the issue is the teachings of the Ahmadiyya, naturally, you will expect people will get angry toward Ahmadiyya everywhere there were mainstream Muslims, Sunni Muslims. But that was not the case. That's one thing. And also the second one, as I mentioned earlier, not in all historical periods Ahmadiyya became the object of violence. Similar with the Shia. There has been debates and others between Muhammadiyah, NU, the Majlis Ulama with the Ahmadiyah. There was even fatwa among the NU, among the Majlis Ulama in 1980s, but we didn't see violent conflicts. The violent conflicts only took place after 2000. So what explains that? The fatwa was already there for a long time, but the conflict is only after 2000. Well, the explanation, I think, should involve reference to the democratization process in Indonesia in 1998, and not only to the theological differences. So there are times and places when or where sectarian differences do not become conflict. The question then is, under what conditions do they become a source of conflict? So my simple conclusion is that the problem is not as much in sectarianism. So there is no need, and probably it's impossible to get rid of sectarian differences. So the main issue is, how do we live with differences, with sectarian differences? What we should resist is the sectarianization as a way of scaling up sectarian ideology and promote an alternative normativity. This is a very simple explanation, but I think it's important to emphasize this. So when we do advocacy, for example, it's clear that what exactly is the main issue. So, for example, in Indonesia, there is Majelis Ulama Indonesia, some fatwa against the Ahmadiyya. Is it okay for Majelis Ulama Indonesia to issue a fatwa against Ahmadiyya, or is it not? I think it's okay. I mean, that's their right. Their main job is to issue fatwa. If you say that they cannot issue fatwa, then that means there's no Majelis Ulama. But the problem is that the government make decisions based on that fatwa, and that takes place. That happens in at some points. There is, for example, a regulation, a decree, which restricts the activities of the Ahmadiyya. It doesn't ban the Ahmadiyya, but it restricts the activity of the Ahmadiyya. So Ahmadiyya is okay; they can worship in their own, etc., but they should not propagate their Ahmadi teachings. Basically, that's the decree. Even that decree, I think, well, there's a long story about this decree, but the main issue with that decree, I think, is that it is based on the fatwa of the Majlis Ulama. So Majlis Ulama has a right to issue fatwa, but the government, the state actually, does not have to listen to it, right? Because it's a different, they function in different spheres. So Majlis Ulama can, if their main concern is to protect Muslims against deviant teachings, then they can issue fatwa, they can do their propagations, they can say that Ahmadiyya is mistaken, etc. That's fine, but not making it as a state law or state regulation. So in this case, again, the sectarianism, I don't think we should battle sectarianism, but how do we deal with it? So, I don't know what time. I think I still have time. Well, we still, yeah. I want now to show another. I will refer to another book which gives also a very good explanation about what is taking place in this sectarianism, or the mechanism of sectarianism. And this is the book's title is Hate Spin. This is, I think, where the main issue we have been seeing both in the Middle East, in Indonesia and many other places. So the subtitle, and I see hate spin as, in my own terms, explaining the mechanism of anti-pluralist scaling up. So the subtitles of the book, this is written by a journalist, Sherian George. He's based in Hong Kong. The subtitle is Manufacture of Religious Offense and its Threat to Democracy. So when dealing with the Shia, the Ahmadiyya, for example, many mainstream Muslims would say that they they defame Islam or they offended my belief. I'm offended. So many Muslim groups said that they take offense, although probably some of the groups which they accuse of deviancy and others, they don't give offense, but others take offense. So it's important to see these two processes. The book is based on a case study of 3 very different countries, but it displays very similar phenomenon of hate spin. That is the US, India, and Indonesia. So the main thesis of the book is that certain beliefs, like in this case Shia, Ahmadiyya, or others, which is regarded as offense to many Muslims, it is actually that kind of offendedness is manufactured. So it's using the available instruments. Like for example, in the case of Indonesia, it uses the defamation of religion law, undang-undang penodaan agama, or sometimes it's also called as blasphemy law. So what actually is this has been? So basically. This is certain groups using certain very sensitive issues like defamation of Islam, for example, and then blow it up. And now with the we are living in the age of social media, it's much easier to do that. And then provoking people, mobilizing people to go against certain group based on that. So the hate. It's not only hate spin. It's not only hate speech, but it's a hate spin. So it's spinning hate around a certain issue. We see this very clearly in the case of the Jakarta election. Probably most of you heard about the case of Ahok. If there's time, I will talk a little bit more about it. But the book is published it was published in 2016, and in 2017, Sherian George, he came to Indonesia. He had a book discussion in some places after, during the case of Ahok, and the whole explanation of hate spin fits very well with what happens in the case of the Jakarta election. So it's very, very interesting. The main premise is that certain type of offendedness is manufactured. There is always a middleman, political entrepreneurs using these kind of issues, and sometimes government or state is drawn into it. That is the case with the Shia, where there is one Shi'i who was tried using the defamation of religion law. There is also the case with the Ahmadiyya, again, because like I said, in other places Ahmadiyya was okay. Why in a certain part of, in a certain place, Ahmadiyya is not okay, for example? In that places, actually, you can always see that there is a political entrepreneur creating hate spin, and then people were mobilized against this group. And when there is such a mobilization, usually the main argument for the government to step in is that they have to maintain public order. But who created this order? Is it the minority groups like Ahmadiyya or Shia, or is it the big groups which mobilize people against these minority groups? Usually, it is the large group which created the public disorder, but the laws such as the defamation of religion law, they are against the minority groups. They are seen as the source of disorder. So this logic is the same in many places. I will not go further with this, but what is interesting is also the questions of how do we deal with it. So There are other several very important avenues we can we can deal with hate spin at the level of state, media, and civil society. At the level of state, Syed George he proposed what he calls as assertive pluralism. I'll talk more about it, but there are several ways in which the state can try to prevent the spinning of hate or the manufacturings of offense, the engineering of hate. And some law, it helps hate spin. Other laws may prevent that. I gave the examples of the blasphemy law. It's actually engendering intolerance. So when like for example, after the Jakarta elections, you can read in New York Times, in many international media, that the defeat of Ahok was a sign of the rise of intolerance, for example. I disagree with that because it's not. First, there were like probably 700 people gathering together in one place. It's too much to call them as all of them as intolerant. They came there with different purposes. They came there with different motivations. And it is only a one-time event. So I don't think we can call that as an indicator of the rise of intolerance. But it's an indicator of the success of this hate spin, of this scaling up, of the anti-pluralist scaling up. I'll talk more about that later. But some laws, like in this case the blasphemy law, which was used against the incumbent governor at that time, Ahok, it helps create intolerance. So intolerance is not only an issue of the of people, of the society, but sometimes, in most cases actually, it's the responsibility of the state. This is where it's very important to look at the state as a factor in civic pluralism or civil Islam, the prosperity or the defeat of civil Islam. State is very important. Even though when we speak about civil Islam, we speak about groups, social groups, societal groups, but state is very important. So one way in which state can work against that is through certain laws such as this, such as the defamation of religion law. So sometimes Indonesian government, when they go outside Indonesia and they were asked about the situation in Indonesia, and then they mention, well, we acknowledge that there are intolerant groups, and this is a democracy. There are many different groups. There are intolerant groups. I think that kind of explanation given by the government, it tries to clean their hands, because part of the intolerance is engendered by law, by the government, by the state. And I suspect we can also see similar issues here in Malaysia. Many regulations which actually engender that. But there are other regulations which may help, like for example, anti-hate speech regulation. Actually, we can see in Jordan, in Emirates, they have these regulations of anti-takfir. I mean, you can be imprisoned if you accuse other Muslims as kafir. In Oman, for example, it's illegal. It's not only not nice, but it's illegal to accuse Shia, for example, as kafir. So certain laws, it may help tolerance, others may not. But the main issue, actually, when we speak about the state, it's not only about law. Much can be done outside of the legal space, that is in the political space. This is where actually the assertive pluralism is important. I give an example here, the recent case in Malaysia, for example, the laundry case. I think that's very, very interesting. I mean, if a leader of that stature says certain things which help some tolerance, it has very clear impact. People will be more careful, etc. But the other example, you can see, I'm sorry, Pak Bob, I give the example of Donald Trump. I mean, if a president like that inciting hate against other groups, you can immediately see the results in the society. So the rise of the racist propaganda, even violence, which you can see increasingly. It has increased very quickly in the U.S. The what is it? Where there was a stabbing of a guy in the train, Portland. Yeah, in Portland, and then Charlottesville. Things which probably I don't imagine that could still take place in the U.S. I lived in the U.S. for 5 years in 1997 until 2002. So 2001 I was there, but I didn't see this kind of emotion even then. In a certain part, actually, the 9/11 actually helps toward more understanding, because there are more and more educational efforts. But what you see today, I don't think you can explain that without referring to what President Donald Trump has done. So the leader, it's very important. I mean, the political space, that's a very important space, and you can do so much even without changing regulations. So like in the case of Indonesia, for example, the defamation of religion law have been brought to the Constitutional Court twice. And the Constitutional Court rejected the petition to revoke the law. So the law will still be there for many years, at least, I think. But even with that law, if the government is firm enough in their pluralism, asserting their pluralism in their political gestures, etc., that will change the situation a lot. And it's interesting. This is the law now is going through its third review. It's going to the Constitutional Court again, and this time it's the Ahmadiyya which brought the law to the Constitutional Court. So this is very interesting, that even Ahmadis, even though they are discriminated, they are persecuted, now actually, I mean, they're in a better situation, so they even dare to go public, bringing a certain law to the Constitutional Court. This is a very interesting case. I don't think they will win, but that's a different issue. But my point, again, the importance of using political space. And another outside state, media is probably most important. Media is the place where hate is spinned. Without media like we have today, especially social media, it's almost impossible that you can do mobilization that fast. But there are also examples, and I recommend you to read the book. The book is very practical. It's not difficult. It's written by journalists, so it's an easy read. And it gives, mostly when it speaks about media and civil society, it gives examples in different countries of how people can battle hate spin. many ways to do that. So I think I'll stop there. I actually have 2 other slides dealing with the specific case of the Jakarta election, because there was a question today, this morning, but maybe I'll return to that if there's some question, but I'll stop now so we can have more discussion. Thank you.